I think, creativity, there's a bigger emphasis on it now because that's one of the things the tools don't really do for you. You have to bring the creative ideas to the tools.
Hello there, my name is Monica Burns, and welcome to today's bonus episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. If you're used to joining me on Tuesdays for new episodes, you are in for a treat. This is a special bonus episode of the podcast in partnership with Jotform. Just like on Tuesdays, these bonus episodes are designed to give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. If we mention something you'd like to check out, you'll find the link to it in the show notes. So don't forget to head to my website, easyedtechpodcast.com, for all of the links and resources from today's episode. This episode is part of a special bonus series presented by Jotform. Jotform provides an all-in-one solution to streamline administrative tasks, enhance community engagement, and foster innovation. Using their no-code, drag-and-drop forms and workflows, your teams can securely collect and store data, automate routine tasks, and collaborate on team resources. Educational institutions are also eligible for a 30% discount on Jotform Enterprise. Head to their website to learn more. jotform.com/enterprise/education. And a quick note, this episode is part of a special bonus series. You can find the video version exclusively on Jotform's YouTube network. Today's episode is titled Art, Technology, and Student Voice in the Classroom with Tim Needles, a bonus episode with Jotform. And today, we're diving into the intersection of art and innovation with Tim Needles. As a veteran educator with over 2 decades of experience, Tim really understands how to bridge the gap between high-tech tools and creative thinking. We talk about his book, STEAM Power, and Tim offers some practical strategies for integrating technology into an art classroom, using art when we're talking about technology. It's a really great conversation, and I know you're going to get some strategies you can bring back into your work. Let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited today to talk about art, technology, student voice in the classroom. But before we get into all of that, can you share with listeners a bit, what is your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
So, I'm really an art teacher, but I'm currently on teacher on special assignment as a technology integration specialist for K-12. So my day-to-day is like totally different every day. So, I'm doing everything from helping teachers plan to, co-teaching to doing PD and training people to really big picture ideas and problem solving. So, it's going to be a really different day, which is kind of exciting, to be honest. I spent, 25 years in the classroom. So, the change is kind of nice.
Yeah, I would imagine just that idea of now like getting this window into all these other worlds in your school district, right? Just to get a sense of what other people are doing, what they're thinking about, probably awesome opportunities to talk about art education in addition to the technology of it all. And, you really do work at this intersection of art, design, tech. How has that intersection changed in K-12 classrooms over even just the past decade?
Yeah, it shifted quite a bit. I mean, technology plays just a bigger part in, I think, every classroom, but notably in art, because so much of it was traditional. And, with media arts, I used to teach an animation class, where it would take 2 weeks to do like a 2-minute animation. Yeah. And now it takes 2 minutes to do a 2-minute animation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think artificial intelligence has made a big impact there. Some art teachers are really still hesitant. Other people really embrace it. So, just like a lot of other places, it's sort of going through a pretty big evolution.
Yeah, I would imagine you're hearing a lot from both sides of that spectrum of saying like, yes, let's bring this all in to, oh my gosh, let's put a big pause on this. Like, we're not ready. I don't want to do that. Right. I can imagine people are coming to you probably with a variety of perspectives. And when we hear, technology in the arts, sometimes it's the tools that come first into that conversation as opposed to the arts or the design component. So how do you help teachers, whether they're really excited about the tech or the AI, right, of it all, or whether they're very hesitant, how do you help them think about purpose before platform?
I think that's kind of essential. I mean, like you could play with technology and make it like, something that could lead you in a direction. That certainly happens with any kind of art. Like, if you're experimenting with a new media, you can kind of, end up in places you didn't expect, but you really want the concept to come first. I think that's
Mhm.
the way it really should work. I never wanted to teach tools. So,
Yeah.
sometimes you see people teaching specific tools, and I'm like, technology evolves too fast for that to really be valid.
Mhm.
So, it has to be like the concept and like what's the best thing that serves that concept. And I think it works better too, because sometimes, it's not the most obvious tools you're using, and you're going to be using tools that maybe you're not as familiar with, but that leads to opportunities of like, unexpected magic moments too.
Yeah. And, I know when I work with teachers too, one of the big things I think about is, right, you need to have some tools in your tool belt or kind of like have a sense of what you might want to reach for in a moment, but it's not the purpose of what we're doing, right? Just helping make that thing happen. So, how do digital tools change the creative process itself, especially for students who may not see themselves as artists, might not use that label?
Well, the tools that actually make it easier to enter the creative space, which is kind of one of the exciting things that I really like about the technology, is that it's lead to the democracy of really creativity.
Yeah.
And I think, creativity, there's a bigger emphasis on it now, because that's one of the things the tools don't really do for you. You have to bring the creative ideas to the tools. It's not going to do it there for you. You could do amazing things, but I think that's one of the exciting things is that, I remember years ago, Francis Ford Coppola was talking about movies, and he said, like, one day, a 12-year-old in Idaho is going to be able to make a feature film. And like, we're kind of there. Like, you could kind of
Mhm.
do almost anything you could imagine. So, really strengthening that imagination, that creativity, that collaboration is a little bit more important than just, knowing the tools. So, I totally agree. You do need to know some tools in order to kind of like be able to navigate that space, but you could also have room to play. And I think that's kind of
Mhm.
the fun part, as in the arts and in the greater creative sphere. And I think that when you look at even science, they do the same kind of thing. So like,
Mhm.
there's a little room for play there too.
Yeah, right. That tools evolve, right? What you might have access to one year over another. A science classroom's a really great example, right? I'm sure we can both think back, a decade or three, right? To how much, that has changed in a science classroom, just the access people have to the models, right? All the things, right? So this isn't just, something that happens in an art environment, but I think in an art environment, we really do focus in on that creative process. So it's a great starting point, maybe, or a great area to focus in on for part of that conversation. And, I appreciate what you said too about democratizing that experience for students who maybe wouldn't call themselves an artist or would struggle to accept that label, right? Even if they are, right, doing all these wonderful things, the fact that it gives them a way to bring an idea to life, right? We've seen some of the generative AI, image creation tools, right? Different things that a student might use to help, as part of that creative outlet. So, I wonder, how do technology rich art experiences support some of these process skills and, some of the skills that go, post process, if you will, like iteration or critique or reflection?
Yeah, it's actually facilitated a lot of it. I mean, because you're able to create faster, so you're less tied to, one of the problems I always had as an art teacher is people spend a lot of time on their work and they kind of get married to it and they don't want
Yeah.
to see
Mhm.
different iterations. But now because you're able to create faster, even before you build, sometimes like you're able to pre-visualize things, it gives you an opportunity to iterate a number of times and get sometimes a much better product. And it also just allows for a different level of critique too. So, digitally having like 30 different artworks on the same page just makes it easier to compare and contrast and notice things and celebrate the creative moment. So I think it's really done wonders in these regards. And that part of the process is really important, because so many of the kids that, go into art classes don't necessarily go into the arts. But that creativity could
Mhm.
really play a part in regardless of what they do. So knowing how to iterate, knowing how to edit, knowing how to understand and critique are all valuable skills.
And that's such a great point about what students might experience in an art classroom environment. But then, right down the line, right, they may not be in a field that is an art, field, right? But I say that because, labels are funny right? When we talk about like what, might, constitute one or another. But, likely, right, they're going to be in a space where they have to have more than one draft of something. They need to collaborate. They need to ask for feedback, accept feedback, right? Easier said than done in some instances, or give feedback, which can also be tough for someone who's not quite sure how to do that. And then, of course, reflect like, how did that meeting go, right? How was that email received, right? Even these things that might not seem like they fall under a creative, umbrella, or they only fit maybe in a creative umbrella, really translate into so many different experiences students have and then professionals have. So I think what you said about just that almost faster pace of iteration, the different ways we might critique and reflect on something, just really jumps right into so many different experiences kids might have outside of an art classroom. So how can art and technology together support student voice, especially for learners who struggle with more traditional forms of assessment or written expression?
Yeah, we've been talking for so long in education about assessments and sort of like, moving away from teaching to the test and that kind of thing. Of course, our teachers never really did that anyway. So like that was the
Mhm.
freedom in the world of the arts. But I think it does a tremendous amount for student voice. I mean, like I'm a big fan of storytelling and, teaching students just the way to tell their story and the way to sort of advocate for their beliefs and what they want to do. It's so much easier to do now in a more powerful way
Mhm.
thanks to some of the art and technology tools. So, one of my most popular sessions I do at conferences is about creative student advocacy. So you're able to kind of help students, really put a powerful message out there. So knowing, visual thinking and understanding how important visual storytelling is. And, so much of, their world is sort of like social media and things like
Yeah.
that, and sort of understanding, how to put your voice in that kind of world in a meaningful way is really powerful. So, it's really nice for that. And it's really interesting because I feel like, when you kind of give students the skills and the understanding of how to approach this, they're really able to advocate for themselves and have a much bigger voice. So, you always want to be the microphone, as a teacher and kind of like hand it to the students. And it really does work wonders.
A quick note from the presenter of today's episode, Jotform. Jotform lets you build a form in minutes. Student survey forms, homework submission forms, online quizzes, and so much more. You can start from scratch, or if you want to get a head start, check out their collection of free form templates designed with teachers, schools, and districts in mind. Learn more about Jotform and how educational institutions can get a 30% discount on Jotform Enterprise. Head to their website to learn more. Jotform.com/enterprise/education. And for students who are consuming so much of other people's voices, right, of content from other creators, just that idea that they are given the strategies, they're given the support, they're given the, that enthusiasm from an educator, right, who is right there by their side, encouraging them to share in that way is huge. And, I would imagine, right, from the time that you've spent in the classroom, your work as an art educator have seen so many changes in terms of access to technology. So when you're planning a unit, when you're coaching, a teacher in your current role, how do you decide when technology belongs in a lesson and when it doesn't?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's nice to have those lessons, even as a person who loves technology that
Right.
don't have technology. I think
Yeah.
there's a place for both things. I think we're seeing that more and more now. But I think it's all about serving the learning. So like I came up in the world of like storytelling and filmmaking, and you see like it's always supposed to serve the story. And I feel like with education, it's the same thing. like, what is going to support this learning the best? And, so I like to also experiment with this sometimes as well. So like, sometimes even though it feels like it's obvious to connect technology, it's a good time to actually try it without it and see how it works as well. So I feel like, it's not, it's something that's easier. Like I started teaching at my current district in 1999. So like
Mhm.
I remember putting in for the first computer. So like,
Yeah.
there's a massive change in technology,
Mhm.
as the person that's now helping everyone with AI. But I think, one of the things you kind of learn is that, lots of different tools could work for different situations. So, it is important to kind of bring that sense of play and really, think about the message and that's coming across in the, what is the main goal, and always kind of use that as the piece, because, technology changes. Sometimes things are available, some things are not. So, I've done the same lesson like 40 or 50 different ways sometimes with different classes, and you get to see the results. So, like, you do gain a wisdom over time that it's really helpful to kind of go and help younger teachers, especially, navigate that and say, like, oh, this tool would be really great to amplify the student aspect of
Mhm.
this and make it more hands on, or, that kind of thing. So, that's something where definitely, time teaches you some of those lessons, but it's also the student body. So, the students that you're working with, like what's going to work best with them is always a question I ask. Because, for some students, hands-on is going to just work better. It could be cardboard, glue, and like classic
Yeah.
things, where for some people, they're going to really respond to technology. So, you always want to be student-centered in terms of that question.
And that's a really great reminder for someone who's maybe tackling that decision. Like, is this the right time? Is this the right moment to bring something in? You may be part of leading the discussion on that, right? Not just making the decision, right? Letting students have that choice, that opportunity. As someone myself who loves to make the most, right, of technology, digital tools, what's out there, there are times where, I see a book and I say, I want to listen to this, right, on audio, or this one is perfect for my Kindle, or I need this in paperback, right? Like I need to go to the library for this book. And I don't always know like exactly what drives that decision. Like there's some trends for me probably as a reader, right? But it's all about having that choice and kind of looking at the moment and deciding, what is going to be the best fit. And I would imagine, speaking of books, right, you're thinking about this as an ISTE author too, So I'm curious as, how do you just see, like, how do you see the arts supporting these bigger, broader goals around creativity, design thinking, and even digital citizenship?
Yeah, I think, design thinking it was always very natural as an art teacher. Like, it's something that like was intrinsic. And then I learned the name for it. I'm like, oh, I've been doing this. Okay,
Yeah.
terrific.
Mhm, mhm. Right.
But I think digital citizenship is something that has become a bigger focus recently, and it's something that's so evolving too. I mean, like it's more important than it's ever been, because I taught, a lot of media arts. A lot of my students went into film and animation and the media world. So, it's helpful to have some of those students come back and actually talk to the students that are in the school now to kind of get a better idea of like,
Mhm.
how important media literacy is, because you see how manipulated things can get. So, I think it's very relevant. And I think, it's kind of interesting to see, it become a thread that, I really feel like we should have, a specific like AI literacy class
Mhm.
for all, incoming high school students at this point, because there's digital literacy and then like AI
Yeah.
specific literacy, because it's
Mhm.
just become that much of a need. Because about like 50% of what you see on social media now is potentially fake. Understanding how to how to investigate some of like, the media is really important.
Oh, yeah. And, just the idea that students as consumers, as
Yeah.
creators, right, they are interacting with AI tools and content that's been produced, by AI tools. And, I want to ask you before we finish up today, specifically about this AI piece. So, is it AI? When I ask you, right, what trends in technology and the arts are you paying the most, attention to? Is AI really playing that big role in your work, or is there something else that you're watching closely?
AI is interesting, but it's sort of like not there yet in terms of like, there's people using it in really interesting ways. Like there's a piece of the Museum of Modern Art where they took all of the collection and made it into a moving AI piece. So like that's using AI in a really interesting way. But, I'm also definitely looking at the virtual reality world, because like finally that, sort of like you're getting more
Mhm.
aware of technology with which allows, more interesting things. It's nice to have like a, pair like a video camera on my
Yeah.
head all the time and be able to take pictures and video where I am. And like whenever any kind of new tool comes out, like I kind of look at it through the lens of an artist and say like, what can I do with this? That's an interesting way. It's often using it not as prescribed is often the way that it sort of
Mhm.
like comes about. But it's interesting to sort of watch that space and kind of, there's a movement towards like installation art and experiential art where
Mhm.
like Yayoi Kusama, where you're going into a whole
Yep.
room, that you kind of like, you're transformed. So that is always really exciting. And once you have that experience, it's like it's hard to go back to just the flat world of,
Yeah.
drawing and painting, because it's like, oh, like when you get to step into the artist world, it's an exciting thing. So like it's always, I pay close attention to sort of what's happening there. But just like, when the camera was invented, they thought like painting was going to die, and painting's doing fine.
Right.
So like, a lot of artists are really afraid about, the impact of AI just because of its capabilities. Because, you're able, like, I couldn't send a student into graphic design or illustration now because like those fields have just been so disrupted.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's possible, but like, you're able to do things with technology you never could before. So, you're able to, harness some of, those tools and actually create in a way you never could too. So it's exciting. It's a fun time to watch, a little scary, but mostly exciting.
Yeah, I think disruptive is like a great word, right? To sum that up. And I'm so glad you mentioned some of the AR VR piece, because sometimes AI gets all the attention
Yeah.
right now, right? When we make a connection between ed tech and a different, space. And just I think it was last spring, I went to MoMA in New York City, and they had an AR, installation where you have, an iPad as you're looking at different things, right? So, there's all these different layers to thinking about what is moving and changing, different types of art experiences students can have, we can have, right, as educators. So yes, AI might be a part of it, but it's not the only piece. I think that's exciting. Right? So
Yeah, I would even
to
add like,
watch.
another exciting piece is like, AI and fabrication, so 3D printing or
Hmm.
laser etching. So, after reading my book, I had connected with NASA, and it was exciting to see like they were using AI to design pieces of the space shuttle and things like that. And of course, people design it based on what has been designed in the past. So you're
Right.
designing it based on, and then like, AI was coming up with totally different looks. So it felt like it came out of an alien movie, but it's structurally sounder and lighter weight and more cost efficient. So, like the 3D printing, like a lot of schools when 3D printing came out, all got like their MakerBot,
Oh
and like
yeah.
everyone
Hmm.
started. But like now you have a wide variety of tools. You're able to 3D print in all different materials. So it's
Hmm.
super exciting to see that area too.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, it's wild to see how much has changed in 5, 10, 20 years, right, in these spaces. And there's, I'm sure, a lot of change on the horizon too. So this was wonderful. Tim, thank you so much for sharing all of these, strategies, your insights with listeners. Where can people connect with you? Where can they learn more about your published work and the work that you do on a regular day?
So I'm on all social media at Tim Needles. I have a website, tim-needles.com. And then I put out a video every week during the school year about a different technology too on my YouTube page.
Perfect. And we'll link out to all those things for people to check out your work and follow along. So thank you so much for your time today.
Great. Always good talking to you.
It was lots of fun chatting with Tim Needles today. So let's make this EdTech easy with a few key points from the conversation. Art education has shifted dramatically as technology, media arts, and AI have accelerated creative workflows. Concepts should drive tool selection because tools change too quickly to teach in isolation. Digital tools democratize creativity, making it easier for students who don't see themselves as artists to enter the creative process. Technology speeds up iteration and enables stronger critique practices, helping students build skills they'll use far beyond art class. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from today's episode by heading to easyedtechpodcast.com, including all of the ways to connect with Tim Needles. A big thank you to Jotform, the presenter of today's episode and the special series. If you want to watch the video version of this episode, you can find it exclusively on Jotform's YouTube network. Just head to YouTube and type Jotform in the search bar. To learn more about Jotform and how educational institutions can get a 30% discount on Jotform Enterprise, head to jotform.com/enterprise/education. If you're listening to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or another favorite app, maybe even YouTube, don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button. When you follow along with the podcast, each new episode will download for you automatically so you don't miss a thing. It's totally free to follow or subscribe. It just helps you get those notifications so you know when a new episode is available. And if you have a moment and are feeling extra helpful today, please leave a rating or review for the podcast. It helps other educators find this podcast when they're searching for topics like ed tech in their podcast app. Have a great week and check back on Tuesday morning for another new episode of the Easy EdTech Podcast.